Montana Territory, early July of 1878. The sun had just started to slide behind the Bitterroot Mountains when he spotted her barefoot, bruised, and alone walking the trail like she had nowhere else to go. Leighton Foster reined in his horse hard, dust curling up around his boots. He had been riding back from delivering cattle to Missoula, saddle sore and bone-tired, when the figure ahead caught his eye. A woman, maybe in her 20s, feet bleeding, dress torn at the hem, walking like she had been doing it for days. "Ma'am?" Leighton called out, dismounting quick. The woman flinched and turned slow. Her face was flushed from heat and exhaustion. There was dirt on her cheek and a scratch across her collarbone, but her eyes, clear and dark like wet soil, stared straight at him with no fear, just a quiet kind of resolve. "My name's Leighton," he said, holding his hands up, palms out. "I am not here to hurt you. Are you all right?" She did not answer at first. Her lips parted, then pressed tight again. Then she nodded barely. Leighton looked down at her feet. The skin was raw, the soles split in places. He pulled his boots off without a second thought, stepping barefoot into the hot dirt and holding them out to her. "Put these on before you tear yourself open," he said. "You can ride my horse. I will walk." She shook her head. "I do not know you." "No, you do not," he said, voice calm. "But I figure you would rather ride than bleed." She wavered, then finally took the boots with fingers that trembled more from fatigue than mistrust. She slid them on, wincing. They were too big, but it was better than nothing. As he helped her up onto the saddle, he caught the way her hands gripped the horn like she was holding on for dear life. "What is your name?" he asked once they started walking, his horse carrying her slow down the trail. "Zadie," she said after a long pause. "Zadie Nolan." "Well, Zadie Nolan," he said gently. "Want to tell me what happened?" She was quiet again, then said, "My wagon was headed north. I was with my brother's family. They took a wrong turn, went too close to the riverbank. It collapsed. The whole thing rolled." Leighton's stomach dropped. "Are they all gone?" she whispered. "Wagon crushed them. I could not get them out. I tried." He looked up at her, this woman who had been walking alone through open country with no shoes, no food, no rifle. The trail here was rough country, bears, wolves, worse. She had no business surviving, and yet here she was, sitting straight, not shedding a tear. He did not say anything for a while. Just walked beside her horse, his own feet pinched and raw from the rocky trail. By nightfall, they made camp under a pine ridge. Leighton built a fire while Zadie sat still, arms around her knees. He handed her a tin cup of coffee and a strip of jerky, which she took without a word. The silence between them was not heavy. It just was. "You got people anywhere?" he asked, sitting across from her. "No," she looked into the fire. "I was a governess in St. Louis. Came west with my brother after his wife died. I helped raise their 2 children. Her voice caught, and her shoulders stiffened. "I am sorry," he said, voice low. She nodded, but did not speak again for a long time. When she finally lay down, wrapped in his extra coat, Leighton stayed up, watching the fire burn down. Something about her, how she had survived, how she had just kept walking, sat heavy in his chest. Not pity, just something close to awe. By morning, her feet were worse. The skin had blistered and cracked. "You cannot walk like this," he said, lifting her gently to the saddle again. "I got a place about a half-day ride east. You will rest there." "You do not have to do this," she said. "I know," he replied, "but I will anyway." They rode in silence, the morning wind brushing through the yellow grass. She watched him from the saddle sometimes when she thought he was not looking. The quiet kind of man, calm and steady. She had not known men like that back east. They reached his cabin by mid-afternoon. It sat low in the trees near a creek, built solid from river stone and pine. He helped her down, careful not to touch her more than needed. Inside, it was plain but clean. 1 table, 1 bed, 1 chair, a hearth that still smelled faintly of smoke. Leighton brought a basin and helped her wash her feet, his hands gentle as he pressed a cloth to the broken skin. Zadie sat still, watching his face. "You live here alone?" He nodded. "Ranched with my father until he passed." "Stayed after?" "No wife." He looked up, surprised by the question. "No. Never found someone who fit right. She did not answer, but her gaze lingered. For the next 2 days, she rested. He kept mostly outside, chopping wood, tending to the animals, giving her space. He left food and water on the table and did not ask questions. But on the 3rd day, she came out onto the porch, his 2 big boots on her feet. "I can help," she said. He looked up from where he was mending a fence post. "You should be resting." "I am tired of resting." She crossed her arms. "I can cook or sew or anything." He gave her a small nod. "All right. Kitchen is yours." It started simple. She swept the floor, made stew, patched his work shirt. He brought her wildflowers one morning without saying a word, just set them on the table. She smiled at them like they were gold. One evening, he found her sitting by the creek, her bare feet in the water. "I did not mean to stay this long," she said as he sat beside her. "I am glad you did," he answered, honest and clear. She looked at him. "You are a good man, Leighton." He reached into his pocket then, fingers closing around something small. His mother's ring. Silver band, plain but strong. He had carried it for years, never knowing why. Until now. He turned to her, eyes steady. "Zadie Nolan, you were barefoot on that trail, and I gave you my boots. But I want to give you something more." Her breath caught as he held out the ring. "I do not have much," he said. "Just this land, this cabin, and my name. But if you want it, I would be proud to give it to you." She stared at him, tears rising fast, and not from grief this time. "I never thought I would feel safe again," she whispered. "But with you, I do." He slid the ring onto her finger. "Then stay." She leaned forward and kissed him slow, certain, and full of something that had been waiting in her chest for days. And in that quiet space, with the water moving past and the trees swaying above, Zadie Nolan said yes without saying a word. The ring fit her hand like it had been waiting there all along. Zadie wore it without fuss, as if it was simply what came next. Leighton didn't press her with questions, didn't make speeches. Instead, the days shifted around them, subtle, steady, like the slow turn of the season. By the 6th morning, she was rising before him, pulling water from the creek in his dented tin pail, setting it to boil for coffee. She moved through the cabin without hesitation now, her quiet presence leaving small traces, laundered linen folded at the foot of the bed, sprigs of yarrow hung to dry from the rafters. Leighton came in from chopping pine, sweat on his brow, and found a loaf cooling on the hearthstone. "You bake?" he asked, surprised. "Learned young," Zadie said, dusting flour from her sleeves. "My mother kept house for a widower and his 4 sons. There was always something in the oven." He leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, watching her. "What was she like?" "Sharp-tongued," she answered, not unkindly. "Didn't tolerate foolishness? But she'd hum when she braided my hair. Only time she ever sounded soft." He didn't ask more. The past she offered in fragments, and he took each piece as it came. That afternoon, they hitched his team to the cart and rode into the valley east of the ridge, where late wild raspberries had started to show. Zadie sat beside him, skirt tucked under, her hand braced on the edge of the bench as the wheels jostled over old ruts. She didn't ask where they were going until they were halfway there. "There's a neighbor I trade with," Leighton said. "Name's Emmett. Keeps bees. I figured we could use some honey." The cart rattled past a stand of cottonwoods where the leaves had started to curl yellow. "Will he ask questions?" she said quietly. "He might," Leighton replied. "But I won't answer him unless you want me to." She didn't say anything then, but her fingers brushed his wrist where it rested on the reins. Emmett's homestead lay at the edge of a long meadow, the house squat and weathered, smoke curling from its crooked chimney. His wife, Dinah, came out first, wiping her hands on her apron, her face splitting into a smile when she saw Leighton. "Well, look what blew in," she said, then paused when she saw Zadie beside him. "This is Zadie," Leighton said, offering nothing more. Dinah's eyes flicked to the ring, then back to Zadie's face. Whatever she saw made her nod once and step back. "Come in, then. I've got biscuits going." Inside, the house smelled of beeswax and sage. Zadie sat stiff on the edge of a bench while Dinah poured coffee and started in with gentle questions: where she was from, did she sew, did she like to read. Zadie answered cautiously, yet something in Dinah's voice eased her. When she mentioned she taught reading and arithmetic to girls back in Missouri, Dinah lit up. You'll have to meet Miss Lorna, then. Teaches at the schoolhouse near the South Bend. She's always looking for help come autumn. Leighton glanced at Zadie, who'd gone still again. I'll think on it, she said, setting her cup down. On the ride back, her voice was quiet. I'm not sure I'd do well among too many folk just yet. You don't have to, he said. But I might want to someday. He nodded, accepting that truth. That night, she sat beside the fire with her knees drawn up, mending one of his shirts. He watched her fingers move with steady precision. You never asked what I did before, he said. I figured you'd tell me when it mattered. I worked cattle when I was younger, he said. But after my father passed, I kept the land. Didn't see much reason to leave it. I like knowing what the sky's doing, which trees lean too far after a storm. I like quiet. Zadie smiled faintly. Then I think you'll keep liking me. He reached out and brushed a thumb over the edge of her hand. She didn't pull away. Later, when dawn crept in pale and silent, he woke to find her beside him, resting easy against his shoulder. The world outside was still, the kind of hush that came before birdsong. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just listened to the rhythm of her breath and felt the warmth of her hand curled loosely against his ribs. By the end of that week, they began working the land together, her gathering herbs from the North Bend, him laying fence post across the western line. She learned to split kindling, and he watched as she coaxed shoots from the garden row with a patience that rivaled his own. They didn't speak often during the long hours, but when they did, it was about things that mattered: how deep the well might go if he widened it, where the deer bedded down near the ridge, the way the light shifted in the late afternoon, slanting gold across the field. One evening, as they shelled beans on the porch, he said, "You ever think you'd want more?" She looked up. More than this. Children, a bigger house, neighbors close enough to call on. She considered that for a while before answering. If it came in time and with you, then yes. But I don't want to rush what's already good. He nodded, and they fell quiet again, the sound of beans hitting the bowl soft and steady. When the first frost came, they were ready. Together. The first snow came thin and early, dusting over the fields that melted by noon. Zadie stood at the garden's edge, hands folded around a small basket of late onions and thyme, watching the flakes vanish against the earth. Leighton had gone out just after breakfast to check the trapline near the ridge, leaving her alone for the morning. She turned back toward the cabin, the hem of her wool skirt brushing the frost-glinted grass. Inside, the hearth still held warmth from the fire he'd banked before leaving. She added a log, then stirred the ashes, coaxing a slow flame to life. The scent of pine resin filled the room. When she opened the chest at the foot of the bed, she found the folded calico she hadn't touched since he'd given it to her, a deep russet pattern with faded green vines. She hadn't sewn her own dress since Missouri. Her fingers moved slower now, less certain, but she cut the fabric and began stitching it into shape atop the table with quiet resolve. By the time Leighton returned, boots damp and shoulders dusted with melting snow, the bodice was half-shaped and the sleeves pinned roughly in place. He shut the door behind him and leaned his rifle by the frame. That for something special? His voice was low from cold. I thought I might wear it when we visit Dinah again, she said, not looking up. She's asked us back for supper this Sunday. He stepped closer, hands thawing near the fire. You didn't say. I wasn't sure I'd go, she admitted. But I think I want to. He nodded once. Then we will. She glanced up then. His cheeks were ruddy from wind, and his coat smelled faintly of smoke and pine. She had grown used to that smell, found it settling. She stood and crossed to him, reaching for the scarf at his neck, unwinding it slowly. You're soaked through, she said. You'll catch chill. He let her fuss with the buttons of his coat. Didn't interrupt when she tugged it off and hung it near the hearth. There was a fox caught near the south line, he murmured. Young one. I let it go. Her brow lifted. You're soft for a trapper. He shrugged. Didn't feel right. It was shivering something awful. She pressed her palms to his shirt, felt the cold through the linen. Sit. I'll get you dry clothes. He watched her move about the room, the gentle command in her gestures. When she returned with a fresh shirt and trousers, he changed while she turned her back, folding his wet things over the chair. "I've never had anyone look after me," he said quietly once she faced him again. Zadie sat beside him at the table, folding her hands. "No one ever stayed long enough?" "No one ever asked." She reached for his hand, her fingers threading between his. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the cedar branches. Inside, the fire settled into a steady glow. They spent the evening side by side, her sewing slow and deliberate, his fingers whittling a spoon from a scrap of cherry wood. The quiet between them was no longer cautious, it had weight now, like something lived in and shared. Later, she laid the finished dress across the bed, smoothing the seams. He came to stand behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "Looks fine," he said. "I haven't worn anything new in a long time." She turned, and he brushed a strand of hair from her temple. "You don't need anything new to be beautiful," he said. Her breath caught, then steadied. "You've never said something like that before." "I mean it." She leaned into him then, her cheek against the worn cotton of his shirt, and he wrapped his arms around her with a calm surety that said he was exactly where he meant to be. The snow stayed light through the next few days. They prepared for the deeper cold, splitting wood, laying kindling in bundles, salting the last of the meat. She sorted the herbs she'd dried into glass jars, labeling each in tidy script. He reinforced the hinges on the door and patched the chinks along the north wall. On the morning of their supper at Dinah's, Zadie dressed slowly, pinning her hair at the nape of her neck, tying a narrow ribbon she'd found tucked in the bottom of her travel bag. She stepped out of the room to find Leighton already in his coat, his hair combed back, boots polished. He looked at her for a long moment, then offered his arm. They rode out just before dusk, the cart creaking along the hardening road. The mountains loomed distant and quiet in the blue light. Neither of them spoke much, but her gloved hand rested over his on the reins, and he didn't move it. Dinah greeted them with a wide grin and a pot of ham and barley stew already steaming on the stove. Emmett poured whiskey from a jug and asked about the fox, and Zadie found herself answering without hesitation, even laughing once when Dinah's cat leapt onto her lap and startled her. Leighton watched her across the table. She didn't shrink from the kindness offered, didn't flinch when Dinah teased Leighton about his quiet ways. Zadie met the warmth with her own, measured but true. On the ride home, the stars came out sharp and clear. The cold had settled deep, but she leaned into his side, her breath warm against his neck. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For letting me become myself again." He didn't answer at first, just tilted his head so it rested briefly against hers. "You never stopped being her," he said. "You just needed time." The cabin came into view then, lit dimly from within. As they stepped down from the cart, he didn't let go of her hand. Not when they crossed the porch, nor when they stepped inside to the hush of their home, nor when she turned to face him in the firelight. They were still learning each other, still building something quiet and strong. But as she reached up to touch his jaw and he bent to kiss her slow and sure, there was nothing uncertain in the way they fit. It was a life neither of them had expected, but both had chosen, fully and without hesitation. The days shortened without ceremony. Frost lingered longer in the hollows, and the wind turned sharp through the cottonwoods. By mid-November, Leighton had started bedding the stock in closer to the barn, and Zadie lined the cabin windows with strips of wool she stitched from an old travel blanket. One afternoon, while she was boiling water for lye soap, Leighton returned from the south pasture with something tucked under his arm. He set it on the table without a word, a worn ledger with cracked leather binding. "I found it clearing out the far shed," he said, pulling off his gloves. "Pa used to keep track of trade with it. Thought you might want to see it." Zadie ran her hand over the cover. "You think it's still legible?" "Only one way to find out." She opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed but intact, the ink faded but neat. Lines of handwriting catalogued corn seed, wool bundles, 2 bridles mended, 1 barrel of pickled cabbage. Beneath that, a note. "Ode to Dinah's father paid in kind, 1 quilt and a week's labor." Zadie tilted the book toward the light. This goes back near 20 years. I reckon so. She turned a few more pages, then looked up. You ever think of keeping it up? He scratched his jaw. Don't trade like he did. Most everything's done in coin now. But it tells a story. He leaned over to look. What kind? Of how people lived on what they had. Of how they helped each other. Her voice softened. Of who they were. She spent the next few days copying names and dates into a new ledger, her own handwriting careful and clean. When she wasn't doing that, she split beeswax into blocks and poured it over linen squares to make food wraps. Leighton watched her once as she hung them to dry over the hearth. You always stay busy, he said. She stirred the pot with a wooden spoon. Idle hands make room for ghosts. He didn't ask what kind. He didn't need to. The next Sunday, they rode west to check the fence by the creek where one of the posts had leaned too low last storm. Zadie walked the edge while Leighton reset the footing, her skirts tucked up into her belt so the hem wouldn't drag. She'd taken to wearing his second-best coat, sleeves rolled, collar turned up against the wind. When he stood and stretched his back, she was crouched near the waterline, brushing snow from a cluster of tangled vines. Rosehips, she said when he joined her. Almost dried. Good for what? Winter tea. And breathing. She glanced up at him. I used to give it to the children when they had coughs. He held out his scarf. Wrap your hands. I've got tougher skin. She smiled with only her eyes and took it. That evening, after supper, she pulled the rocking chair close to the fire and began sorting the dried rose hips into a muslin pouch. Leighton sat beside her on the floor, legs stretched out, whittling a small box from juniper wood. I've been thinking, she said after a while. Spring will come sooner than we expect. If you'd let me, I'd like to plant flax. He looked up from his carving. For cloth. For oil first. Then thread, maybe. If we can grow enough. I've never tried it. I have, she said. Once. He nodded. Then we'll try. She tied off the pouch and leaned back in the chair, her hand resting against the curve of her stomach without thought. He noticed the gesture but said nothing. The fire cracked softly, throwing shadows across the floorboards. Later, as they lay in bed beneath the heavy quilt she'd stitched from scraps, Zadie spoke into the dark. My father never raised his voice, but when he left, the silence was worse than if he had. Leighton turned toward her, his hand finding hers beneath the covers. I don't plan on leaving, he said. She didn't cry. She just moved closer, her forehead against his collarbone, and breathed in deep. By the end of November, the pond near the north slope had frozen solid. Leighton took her there one morning, a pair of leather-strapped skates slung over his shoulder. You skate? He asked, holding them up. She blinked at him. I haven't since I was a girl. Well, he said, crouching to tie them onto her boots. I haven't ever. She laughed then, the sound low and real, and offered her hands once they stood. Together they wobbled onto the ice, arms linked, steps slow and clumsy. When he fell, she went down with him, both of them tangled in a heap. She laughed again, breath fogging the cold air, and pushed her hair out of her eyes. Maybe we're better off staying on land. He lay back against the ice, grinning up at the sky. Maybe. They stayed until their fingers numbed, then walked back to the cabin hand in hand, skates swinging between them. That night, as frost crawled along the window panes and the fire burned low, Leighton opened a drawer she hadn't seen him touch before. From it, he drew out a folded scrap of parchment and set it before her. What is it? She asked. Deed to the land. The cabin. Everything. Zadie looked at him. I want your name on it, he said. If that's what you want. She stared at the paper, then at him. I told you I wasn't going anywhere. Then let's put it in writing. She reached for the ink and quill without another word. Outside, snow fell quiet and steady, covering the earth in white. Inside, their names sat side by side in black ink, tethered not by promises spoken, but by a life already built, day by day. The ground stayed frozen well into December. Zadie woke one morning to the sound of Leighton splitting kindling outside, the steady thud of the axe, a rhythm she'd grown to find comforting. She dressed slowly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders before stepping onto the porch. The air was sharp with cold, and her breath clouded before her. He looked up when he noticed her, pausing mid-swing. "You should be inside," he said, setting the axe down. "It's bitter out." "I wanted to ask you something," she said, her voice soft in the stillness. "Do you remember the creek bed west of the lower field?" He nodded. "Why?" "There's a patch of birch there. I noticed a few trees had good bark, smooth and wide. If I peeled it careful, I could make a cradleboard." Leighton wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "You thinking of making one?" She met his eyes steady. "I am." He didn't speak for a moment. Then he stepped forward and took her hand, his grip warm despite the cold. "You sure?" "Yes," she said. "I've known for a few weeks. I waited because I needed to feel certain. And I do." He lifted her hand to his mouth and kissed the knuckles, slow and quiet. "Then we'll carve it together." Inside, she set water to boil and pulled down the jar of rose hips she'd dried. He lit the fire higher, then crossed to the narrow shelf where he kept his notebooks. From one, he removed a folded sheet of paper he hadn't yet shown her. "I'd been drawing plans," he said, setting it on the table. "Thought we might build onto the cabin come spring. Just enough room for another bed, maybe a window facing east." Zadie smoothed the paper with her fingers. "It's good. You'd have say in every board," he added. She looked up at him. "And every nail." He reached for the pot and poured the tea into 2 cups. "We'll need to think about a name." "For the child?" He nodded. "I'd like something that remembers," she said. "But not something that mourns." He considered that. "Then maybe we choose something that speaks of beginning." They didn't settle it that day, but the conversation stayed between them like a thread waiting to be pulled. Later that week, they rode out to the birch stand just after noon. The sun hung low but bright, making the snow glare almost blinding. She walked carefully, the frozen earth crunching beneath her boots. Leighton brought a draw knife and a length of canvas to wrap what they gathered. She ran her hands over the trunks, searching for the right one. A young tree stood near the edge, its bark unblemished and tight. "This one," she said. They worked together, him scoring the bark low and even, her easing the sheet free with a steady grip. Once wrapped, they carried it carefully back to the cart. She sat beside him on the ride home, one hand resting on the bundle. That evening, they brought the bark inside and laid it flat near the hearth to cure. Over the next days, he shaped the frame from pine slats, planed and sanded until the edges were smooth. She stitched the lining from linen she'd saved, padding it with wool carded from the trade sack Dinah had sent after their supper together. As they worked, she told him stories she hadn't spoken aloud in years, the way her niece used to hum when she braided her hair, how her brother would lift the baby high above his head and whistle like a bird. Leighton listened, never interrupting, only nodding quietly when the words faltered. He shared pieces to his mother's habit of humming while she shelled peas, the way his father used to whistle low when he was thinking. How the cabin had once felt like a hollow place after they were gone. "You filled it again," he said one night, running his thumb along the curve of the cradleboard. "You brought it back to life." She rested her hand on his chest, heartbeat steady beneath her palm. "We did that together." Winter deepened. They passed the shortest day of the year by candlelight, reading aloud from the one book she'd kept from her trunk, a collection of poetry, the pages soft from use. She read slowly, voice quiet, while he whittled the final piece of the cradle's headrest. When she finished the last verse, she whispered, "I never thought I'd have all this." He looked at her. "You have more than this." "I have you," she said. They didn't need to say anything after that. By late January, the cradleboard stood finished beside the hearth, the bark cured pale and strong, the linen inside stitched with a single row of ivy leaves. Zadie's belly had started to round faintly beneath her skirts, and Leighton had taken to resting his hand there when they sat together in the evenings, quiet and content. Dinah came to visit one morning, bringing dried apples and a length of cotton she insisted would make fine swaddling. She and Zadie sat by the fire, going over names again, Leighton listening from the porch, where he carved a new latch for the barn door. That night, Zadie held his hand as they lay beneath the quilt. "I think I know," she said. If it's a girl, I want to name her Eleonora. It was my mother's name. He kissed her temple. Then Eleonora it is. And if it's a boy? I suppose we'll know when we meet him, he said. The months passed, marked by the rhythms of their life, repairing the roof after a thaw, checking for wolf tracks near the henhouse, harvesting ice from the pond and burying it in sawdust for summer use. Zadie sewed small clothes from scrap, and Leighton built a rocking bench for the porch where she could sit in the shade come spring. When the time came, it was quiet and without fear. Dinah came to help, bringing warm towels and a steady hand. By sunrise, the cabin was filled with the soft cry of a newborn daughter. Zadie held her close, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from pain but from something deeper, a fullness that could not be spoken. Leighton sat beside her, one arm folded around them both. "Eleonora," he said, brushing a thumb over the baby's brow. "She's perfect." They watched the fire burn low, dawn blooming pale beyond the frosted glass. Outside, the land lay quiet beneath its blanket of snow. Inside, everything had changed, and nothing had broken. Years passed, but the stillness of that morning remained. Eleonora grew strong, with her mother's quiet eyes and her father's calm way. Zadie taught her to read beneath the cottonwoods, and Leighton showed her how to mend a fence and listen for weather in the wind. They planted flax that spring, and it grew. By the time Eleonora could walk the length of the porch alone, Zadie had finished weaving her first length of linen cloth from the harvest. Leighton carved a chest to hold it. In the evenings, they sat together as a family, the rocking bench worn smooth beneath them. No words were needed most days. The proof of their life was in the air they breathed, the land they kept, the child they raised. And so the days turned slow and certain. They had come from loss, from silence, from the edge of what could have broken them. But they had not broken. They had built something whole, something good, and they lived fully and together for all the days that followed.